Anyone looking for a good mystery need search no further than the history books, since many strange historical events have never been explained. But as technologies advance and we gain a better understanding of the past, some inexplicable events that have baffled experts for decades are now being solved. And in many of these cases, the results are as strange as the mystery itself. Number 10. In 2008, a team of archaeologists was conducting research in Spain when they came across a remarkable discovery. They unearthed a tomb that seemingly belonged to a very important man. But many years later, the discovery would yield yet another surprise that no one saw coming. When this individual, later nicknamed Ivory Man, was discovered, it was quickly determined that he lived during the Copper Age, which stretched from 3200 to 2300 BC. Upon opening his tomb, it was also discovered that he must have been a high-ranking person, thanks to the ornate artifacts that were found inside, many of which were made from ivory. These included a dagger, an ivory comb, what's described as a finely crafted vessel, a ceramic plate containing traces of wine and what is nowadays considered to be a controlled substance, as well as a full African elephant tusk that was placed in the tomb around the man's head, likely as a form of protection from grave robbers, or perhaps from threats in the afterlife. The skeletal remains were removed from the tomb and sent for testing, and in the meantime, researchers tried to find out as much about this man as they could. It was believed that he may have been a great leader of his time, or at least held a great deal of influence over the leaders of that area. Upon further excavation, it was discovered that more monuments were erected close to the tomb in the man's honor, and when they were analyzed, they were found to have been placed there by people living as many as 3 generations after the Ivory Man was interred. This suggests that they still held him in great regard, and that his legacy had been passed on throughout the years after he lost his life. The items found at these monuments weren't mere trinkets, but highly valuable pieces that would have held a lot of meaning to the people who left them there. One example being a crystal rock dagger with an ivory hilt and sheath. Then, in 2023, researchers stated that they were finally able to determine more about the discovery thanks to endless hours of research, and they revealed, to everyone's surprise, that the figure wasn't actually the Ivory Man, but the Ivory Lady. Thanks to tests done on the teeth of the remains, it was determined that the figure was a woman, shattering the notion that only men were able to hold lofty positions in the ancient world, as previously thought. Unfortunately, just about nothing is known about the tribe or society that she was a part of, and hence we have no idea what position she held all those years ago. But it's assumed that she served in a position of power, and that she was loved by her people who continued to mourn her passing for decades after she was buried. But it is believed that she lived at the time when the Egyptian pharaohs were becoming prevalent, and when the first planned city was being constructed in Mesopotamia. The discovery also further highlighted how little we know about the positions that women held in ancient times, and what roles they played in those societies. Number 9. Many people would agree that their least favorite subject in school was math. While many people thrive at it, many more struggle to come to terms with the more complicated aspects of math, and try to avoid it at all costs once they're done with their studies. But without it and the world's leading mathematicians, the world would be a very different and far less interesting place. Nevertheless, for all the knowledge that experts have about the subject, there are still a few math problems that continue to baffle us, many of which may never be solved. One of these seemingly unsolvable problems is Fermat's Last Theorem, a mathematical conundrum that has eluded scientists for centuries, since it was first proposed by French mathematician Pierre de Fermat in 1637. When he wrote the problem down in the margins of the Arithmetica, a book containing more than 200 algebraic problems, dating back to around 250 AD. The problematic theorem was once said by Scottish mathematician E.T. Bell to be so hard to solve that civilization would likely come to an end before anyone would be able to unravel it. It has its origins in Pythagoras' theorem, which states the following. In a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. This can be written as x squared plus y squared equals z squared. This is a theorem that most of us are familiar with. But what would happen to this equation if the exponent, which in this case is squared, was changed to a number bigger than 2? This is the problem of Fermat's last theorem that has eluded scientists for centuries, since it was believed that there were no whole number solutions. But this didn't stop ambitious scientists and mathematicians from trying to solve it, one of whom was a man called Andrew Wiles. In 1963, when he was just 10 years old, Wiles was living in Cambridge, England, and one day while he was visiting the library, he picked up a book called The Last Problem by E.T. Bell. It contained an explanation of Fermat's last theorem and the efforts that had been made to solve it. Wiles made a promise to himself that he would be the one to calculate the answer, even if it took the rest of his life to do so. To begin with, he studied the Shimura-Taniyama conjecture while studying at Cambridge University. He continued his efforts after he became a professor at Winston University, but kept his work secret to avoid any unwanted pressure from his peers. For the next 7 years, he released some of the work that he'd been conducting on elliptic curves in small increments, giving the impression that he was still hard at work on that problem, when in fact, he was trying to solve the ancient math problem. In 1993, he published his findings, which were then scrutinized by a team of referees who quickly found a problem. Wiles once again started working on fixing these issues, and with the aid of one of his former students, Richard Taylor, he managed to do so the next year. His work was once again checked over the following 2 years, and on the 27th of June, 1997, it was confirmed that the centuries-old problem had finally been solved. He won $50,000 for his efforts, but this meant little compared to the admiration of his peers. Number 8. The German composer Ludwig van Beethoven will forever be considered one of the greatest musical geniuses of all time. But not many people know that he had a tough childhood. At first, his parents prospered since his grandfather was a very wealthy man. But after he passed away, Ludwig's father took to heavy drinking, and before long they were struggling to get by. He had no choice but to leave school at the age of 11, and by the time he turned 18, he was the family's sole provider. He eventually started studying music under a famous composer, and in 1783, he finished his first extant composition, called The 9 Variations on a March by Dressler. From there, his career prospered as he studied with Mozart, who was very impressed with his skill. He played the viola in the theater orchestra, rubbed shoulders with the aristocracy, and on many occasions had to cancel performances when his fellow musicians found his work too difficult to master in time. For the rest of his life, Beethoven was lauded for the fact that he could move an entire audience to tears with his compositions. He became hugely famous and continued composing, often at the request of famous leaders and influential people. And during that time, his social standing only grew. But sometime before 1800, he started noticing that something wasn't quite right with his hearing, and before long it was discovered that he was slowly but surely going deaf, something that would devastate most composers. At first, the discovery made a little difference to his life, and he continued to perform as usual. But by 1802, he was starting to feel the effects of his condition, and he quickly realized that he would eventually no longer be able to hear not only his own pieces, but anything at all. That year, he spent the summer in Heiligenstadt, which today forms part of the 19th district of Vienna, Austria. While here, he wrote a note called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was intended to be handed to his 2 brothers, Karl and Johann. In a nutshell, the note stated that people had started considering him to be a stubborn misanthrope, and while he admitted this to be true, he stated that there was a good reason for his disposition. He continued that from a young age, he was drawn to people who were kind and generous, and he always had the will in him to accomplish great things. But he added over the past few years, he'd been living a nightmare as his hearing was fading, a matter made all the worse by ignorant doctors who told him that his hearing would eventually return. He was finally forced to accept the fact that he would go completely deaf, and his passion for his music started to disappear, along with his courageous spirit. By 1919, he'd completely lost his hearing, and he would ask his friends to write in a notebook whenever they spoke, since he could no longer converse normally. By this time, his playing and compositions had started to suffer greatly, but he continued composing, albeit at a snail's pace. He would eventually pass away on the 27th of March, 1827, aged 56. But he did include one request in the Heiligenstadt Testament. He asked that Karl and Johann contact a physician called Dr. Schmidt immediately after his passing. so that his condition could be studied and revealed to the rest of the world. He was not only referring to his hearing loss, but to the gastrointestinal and liver problems that he was suffering from. But Dr. Schmidt never had the chance to examine Beethoven, since he passed away 18 years before the composer did. His Heiligenstadt Testament was discovered in a hidden compartment in his writing desk after his passing, and since then, experts and scientists have been attempting to figure out what caused his condition, but with very little success. It was known that he'd suffered at least 2 attacks of jaundice during the latter part of his life, but it wasn't known if this was the cause of his passing. His notes and other writings were studied by medical experts, but it was only when samples of his hair were analyzed that the cause of his death was determined. It was found that he was genetically predisposed to liver disease, and that he likely suffered from hepatitis B in the months before his passing. It also helped dispel rumors that he'd suffered lead poisoning, or that he had an autoimmune condition, and the mystery behind his last days was finally revealed. Number 7. The Consolidated B24D Liberator Heavy Bomber was an airplane that was designed and built by Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego, California. It was first introduced in 1941, and the last of these planes was retired just 4 years later when it was found to be vulnerable to attacks, difficult to control in the air, and hard to escape from in an emergency. But 2 years before this was done, a B-24D Liberator named the Lady Be Good was still in service during the Second World War, and on the 4th of April, 1943, it was part of a formation that was sent to drop bombs on Naples in Italy. At the time, the planes were stationed in what is today Benina on the Libyan coast, and the Lady Be Good's crew, the 514th Squadron, 376th Bomb Group, and 9th Air Force, formed part of the 376th Bombardment Group. On board were 9 crew members, namely William J. Hatton, the pilot, Robert F. Toner, the co-pilot, D.P. Hayes, the navigator, John S. Waravka, the bombardier, Harold J. Ripslinger, the flight engineer, Robert E. Lamont, a radio operator, and gunners Guy E. Shelley, Vernon L. Moore, and Samuel E. Adams. This crew took off in the afternoon on the 4th of April, on what was their first operational flight. The plan was for the planes in the bombardment group to take off in waves, leaving the last of the group to catch up with those in front. 25 aircraft were all slated to undertake this mission, and the Lady Be Good was part of the second wave to take off that afternoon. Along the way, though, the plane started experiencing technical issues, and Hatton contacted the base to inform them of this. Some of the planes, including the Lady Be Good, had to turn back before reaching Naples, since sandstorms in the Sahara Desert had made visibility extremely poor. But on the way back to the base, the plane's direction finder started acting up, and Hatton asked for assistance. Personnel back at the base fired flares up into the sky as a navigational aid, but the crew aboard the plane seemingly didn't see them, as they overshot the base and kept flying even further into the unforgiving desert. For the next 2 hours, the crew searched for the base, but were unable to locate it. Nothing further was heard from the craft, and it was assumed that it had either been attacked by enemy planes, or that it had run out of fuel and crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, or the desert. Then, in 1958, the British Petroleum Company was exploring the Sahara Desert in search of oil, when they made an unexpected discovery. A survey team had stumbled upon the partially buried remains of an airplane in the sand. It had traveled 440 miles from the base, and inside, the crew's belongings were found along with their food and logbooks. Strangely, the radio was still operational, leaving investigators wondering why it wasn't used when the crew got lost. By 1960, 7 of the 9 crew members were found, one of whom had kept a diary of the events that unfolded that night. It revealed that when the plane ran out of fuel, the crew decided to bail out, believing they were flying above the ocean, but to their surprise, they landed in the desert. One soldier's parachute had failed to open and he lost his life. The remaining crew wandered through the desert in search of aid until they ran out of food and water, and ultimately they all perished. Vernon Moore was never found, but the mystery of the location of the Lady Be Good had finally been solved 15 years after it mysteriously disappeared. Number 6. England isn't the first place that most people think of when discussing the existence of extraterrestrials, but it's where one of the subject's strangest mysteries took place in the mid-1970s, when crop circles started appearing in farmers' fields without explanation. But this was not the first time that crop circles were reported. The first of these was seen in Hertfordshire, after a farmer and crop owner had gotten into an argument over the price of having the crop mowed. The farmer felt that the man was overcharging him and declined his services, stating that the devil himself would mow his crop for a better price before storming off. That night, the farmer became concerned when he saw a bright light out in the field, and when he went to investigate the following morning, he was shocked to find a series of perfectly round circles mowed in his field. He never worked that piece of land again, believing that his prediction about the devil had come true. A few more of the circles were reported over the years, but in the 1970s, they started to appear more frequently, leading people to believe that they were being created by extraterrestrial beings, but no one understood why. As a result, many self-proclaimed experts started investigating, and soon hundreds of conspiracy theories started popping up. Some people believed that strange patterns were created by extraterrestrial craft that were landing in these fields, while many others thought that they were the result of Earth's magnetic energies, or even ancient spirits. Others suggested that the government was to blame, suggesting that they'd been carrying out secret weapons testing in rural areas where their presence would be the least disruptive. But the prevailing theory was that they were being visited by alien creatures, and that they were using these crop circles to leave us messages. But without the knowledge to decode them, we had no idea whether the messages were warnings or friendly introductions. For decades, people marveled at the appearances of these circles, and each time they were widely reported on. There were, of course, skeptics who claimed that these designs were being created by humans in the dead of night, and that the entire fiasco was nothing more than an elaborate hoax, but neither side had any proof to back their claims. Soon, groups of people called croppies started attending the sites where the circles appeared, in an effort to learn more about them and perhaps find some proof that they were being created by beings from beyond the stars. But in 1991, they were forced to admit that they'd been wrong all along, when two men, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, finally came forward to admit that they were the ones who'd been creating the strange shapes. Number 5. The Earth's oceans remain largely unexplored, and hence they're often the sources of strange and alarming events that are yet to be explained. But the seas have been a source of mystery for centuries, as sailors long ago used to believe that they contained massive sea monsters that could break a ship in half without much effort. Some even reported seeing huge sea serpents and octopus that encircled their ships, mermaids that swam alongside their vessels, and strange lights appearing under the water's surface with no apparent origin. Today, most of these mysteries have either been debunked or dismissed altogether. The lights were likely caused by bioluminescent creatures. It's believed that dolphins were mistaken for mermaids, and in the centuries that have passed, no one has found the remains of any sea monsters, not the type described by ancient sailors anyway. We usually associate these types of tales with days long gone, but in 1997, a deep-sea mystery took the world by storm when a group of researchers heard a sound in the ocean that they could not explain. They were listening for and monitoring underwater volcanic activity in the southern Pacific Ocean with the use of underwater microphones that were spaced about 2,000 miles apart. In the hours that followed, they heard the sound several times, but due to its unique characteristics, they were unable to figure out what its source was. The sound became known as the Bloop, and when it was revealed to the public, hundreds of theories were suggested. The most prominent of these was that it was being made by some ancient sea monster that had somehow survived in the water undetected for centuries. Others thought it may be the sound of a normal sea creature, but that we just never heard it making any sounds before. Some people believed it was the sound of a massive whale, engine noise from a ship, secret military exercises, or noise from nearby fishing vessels using their winches. Scientists from the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory were hard at work to find the source of the sound, but with little success. But as the years passed, researchers continued their studies of underwater volcanoes, and it was only in 2005, when they were monitoring an area close to Antarctica, that they finally found an answer to the Bloop mystery. Microphones picked up the very same sound that had been recorded in 1997, and the source was quickly identified as an iceberg. As the mass of ice started to crack open, it emitted the strange sound that left people perplexed for more than a decade. And while it was far more mundane than a massive screeching sea monster, researchers were elated to finally reveal the true answer to this mystery. Number 4. During the 1760s, an area of southern France became the site of a strange and terrifying mystery that remained unsolved for a very long time. The area, called Jvu Dawn, was seemingly under attack by a vicious creature that slew anyone who crossed its path. The first sighting of the creature occurred in 1764, when a young girl was out in a field looking after her livestock. She was later found deceased, and according to those who found her, the culprit could only have been a beast sent by the devil. They could not have expected, though, that this would only be the first of dozens of similar attacks. Over the next few months, more people were found deceased, having their lives ended in a similar way. Most of the victims were either women or children, but on a few occasions, men walking alone at night were attacked and seemingly had no chance of escape. A few witnesses came forward to report that they'd seen a massive wolf, bigger than any other they had seen, stalking through the town's countryside. It was reported by some to stand as high as a horse, and if this was indeed the case, no one would stand a chance against the monster. The local police started investigating, and tens of thousands of people volunteered to help track it down. The authorities offered a cash reward to anyone who bested the animal and provided proof that it was no longer alive. Soldiers dressed in women's clothing in hopes of luring the beast out into the open where it could be hunted, but to no avail. By October of that year, the story was being reported on in newspapers across the country, and before long, news of the mystery had reached foreign soil. It was being discussed in England, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, and for the next 3 years, it remained a baffling tale, almost too outlandish to be true. Professional hunters were brought in to track the beast, but with no positive result. King Louis XV sent several of his men to find it and put an end to its reign of terror, but they also failed. Soon, the beast took on mythical status, and few people dared venture outside after dark. It became known as the Beast of Jvu Dawn, and as the years passed by, rumors of its existence became ever more exaggerated, with some witnesses adding that it had red glowing eyes or that it simply disappeared from sight at will. The mystery persisted until the 19th of June 1767, when a farmer called Jean Chastel happened upon a large male wolf while out on his property. He quickly fired at it and instantly ended its life, after which no more attacks were reported. The reports that it was the size of a horse, that it had glowing eyes, and had the ability to vanish were all found to be fabrications, likely brought on by adrenaline or some kind of hysteria following the attacks. Historic records show that wolf attacks were more common in that area back then, and that they became a real concern. It's been suggested that the wolf population soared at the time, and that the wolves needed to venture closer to human settlements to find food. If they happened upon an unsuspecting person traveling alone, they would have been seen as an easy meal that was unlikely to pose much of a threat. It's also been speculated that this particular wolf may have been suffering from rabies, but whatever the case may be, local residents could finally go about their lives as they had before the attacks began. Number 3. Usually, when archaeologists uncover a relic, they have a fairly good idea who left it there, when it was made, and who left it where it was found. But in some cases, they uncover something that leaves them scratching their heads, and it takes years to find the answer. Many of these mysteries have to do with ancient languages. Since we have no way of deciphering some of these languages, experts are unable to determine who the artifact belonged to, or what its purpose was. One such item was uncovered by a group of archaeologists from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel in 2017, in an area called Tel Lachish. They were accompanied by researchers from the Southern Adventist University in the United States, and led by 3 professors, Joseph Garfinkel, Michael Hazel, and Martin Klingbeil. While it was quickly determined that the artifact was some kind of comb fashioned out of ivory, it was also noted to contain strange writings on its side, which could not be deciphered at the time. The writing was barely legible since the inscription was shallow to begin with, and then spent a long time buried in the soil, which would have caused it to fade even further. In fact, the writing was so faint, it was only discovered 5 years later in 2022, and unsurprisingly it caused a lot of excitement. The comb itself was small, measuring about 3.5 by 1 inches, which meant that the writing was even smaller and hence hard to spot. The comb has teeth on each of its two sides, some of which had broken off over the years that it spent in the elements. The center of the comb was found to be worn away slightly, likely by someone who used it quite often. But the most perplexing part of the artifact was the writing, and Dr. Daniel Vainstub, a Semitic epigraphist, decided to try and decipher it. He eventually surmised that the writings were very early Canaanite and that the comb contained 17 letters forming 7 words. It was the first time that a complete Canaanite sentence had been discovered in Israel, and it was dated to about 3,700 years ago. Most combs that have been found over the years were fashioned out of wood or bone, meaning that the ivory comb likely belonged to someone with some wealth or importance. But we now know, thanks to this man, that they likely suffered from head lice, as when the inscription was finally translated, it revealed the sentence, "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard." Number 2. Many people think of the ancient Vikings as a savage and barbaric people, but overwhelming evidence has found that this is not the case. It's been suggested that these rumors were spread by men in England who were taken aback by the fact that the Vikings bathed often, took care of their hair, and even dressed in fresh clothing on occasion. According to this theory, the women in England found this to be a nice change, and before long they started showing interest in Viking men, causing jealousy, and hence the rumors that they were nothing more than pillaging barbarians. We now know for certain that the Vikings, like most people, were fond of gold and treasure, and that they created some beautiful pieces of jewelry that have since been discovered by archaeologists. We also know that once they started traveling to England and Europe, many Vikings forwent their ancient faith and started worshipping as Christians. Hence, many of the artifacts that have been found over the years follow a Christian theme, such as a Golden Crucifix that was found in 2016. On the 11th of March of that year, amateur metal detectorist Dennis Fabricus Holm, who hails from Denmark, had the good fortune of being let off work early, and he took the opportunity to do some metal detecting near his hometown of Onslev. He'd only been practicing the hobby for a few months, and so he couldn't believe his luck when the detector beeped, indicating that there was something under the soil. And when he dug it out, it was found to be an ornate cross. It measured just 1.6 inches in height, but contained some very fine filigree and gold threads that formed the image of a person on a cross. At first, he thought it was a smooth golden cross, but when he turned it over, he discovered that it was actually a crucifix. He immediately knew that the artifact was an old one, since a nearly identical silver crucifix had been found in Sweden in 1879, and on that occasion, it was found to have originated with the Vikings. Dennis took to social media, where he revealed what he had found, and it was suggested that he had the artifact dated and appraised. He added that as soon as he found the piece of jewelry in the mud, he'd been unable to think of anything else, since he believed it to be very valuable and perhaps historically significant. He had it dated and was surprised to learn that it was created in the early 10th century, before Denmark's rulers had officially accepted Christianity. It's believed that it was worn by a woman as a piece of jewelry, but it didn't fit with the narrative that we had on the Danes and Christianity. It's now being suggested that some Danish people started accepting Christianity about 15 years before their leaders did. So there's a real case being made for history books to be rewritten to include this fact. Number 1. Abraham Lincoln will forever be considered one of America's greatest presidents. He's known as the Great Emancipator, since he was responsible for abolishing slavery in the country in February of 1865. And his assassination by actor John Wilkes Booth just 2 months later has been written about at length over the years. But Lincoln was also the subject of a strange mystery that was finally solved in 2015. One would think that an American president's ancestry would be well known, but this was not the case with Lincoln. We've always known that his father was Thomas Lincoln and his mother was Nancy Hawks Lincoln, but that's where our knowledge of his mother's side ended. A lot of research has been done on this subject, but it wasn't until Vicky Rennie Paulson, who always knew that she was related to Lincoln, started investigating that some answers were finally revealed. For more than a century, historians have been baffled by this mystery, and many felt that Nancy Lincoln was the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks, who was known to have been married to a man named Henry Sparrow. Lewis Warren, a preacher from Milwaukee, suggested that Nancy Lincoln was born to James Hanks, the brother of Lucy Hanks and his wife Lucy Shipley, but no solid proof of this was ever found, and it remained mere speculation. When she turned 16, Vicky decided to trace her roots to the former president to try to find out who his mother's family was. She'd always shown interest in Lincoln's ancestry, but was left frustrated when her relatives could only reveal that they were related through the Hanks family and nothing more. She contacted the Houston-based genetics company, Family Tree DNA, in 2002, and they started identifying modern-day relatives of the Hanks. Utilizing DNA testing, they were finally able to determine that Lucy Sparrow was Nancy Lincoln's mother, and she had indeed been born illegitimately. They immediately contacted Lucy and revealed what they had discovered, and she was left amazed. She tried to contact her sons to relay the news, but had to leave them messages since she was overwhelmed and had started crying. When they contacted her to find out what was wrong, they were just as surprised by the news, but delighted to finally have the answers that they'd been looking for so long. Since then, Vicky has written several books on the Hanks family and their relation to the ex-president following these revelations. But she's not stopped investigating the lineage, since she believes that it's not just her family that is related to Lincoln. She's since stated that she's overjoyed about the fact that Nancy Lincoln's true family had been revealed after more than 150 years of anonymity. Perhaps with further research being done, more of Lincoln's descendants will be identified, giving us further insight into the lives they lived more than a century ago. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.